you want to say about the report?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, this is the 42 report. So definitely first place is you guys have some catching up to do.
This was for homework 3, right?
This was for project 1. We probably should have mentioned.
Oh. Okay, we're going to start with a little recap. So we introduced React last lecture, which is just a library to build better UI and interfaces. So we covered 3 main aspects: components, state, and props. Now we're going to go to hooks. So we covered use state. So there are 2 main hooks: use state and use effect. We covered use state last lecture. It's basically, so going over it again, it's basically used to manage some sort of state inside your component. It can be used sort of like a memory for your functional component. So use state returns an array of 2 elements called a pair. So this sentence here, like this block of code here, what we're actually doing is, since use state returns an array of 2 elements, we're kind of destructuring the array, and the first element returned from use state is stored in the variable count. And the second element which is returned is going to be a function, which is going to be our set count. So we usually use sort of like something and then a function which changes that variable. And since we're putting 0 here, the default or the initial value of count will be 0. So this is sort of an example. We have a counter here. We've created the variable and we're using state. And we've passed in the variable count inside of a return block. And once we click on the button, it calls the function set count, which increments the count once we click on the button. So the count variable will be incremented. And why we use state, like the purpose of it is to kind of like, when it changes, it's going to re-render. So if I created like a local variable, then my page would not refresh or re-render, like my component won't re-render. So the variable here would not be updated. But since I'm using use state, it's going to be updated to the new value which was set here. So use effect is another hook. You can sort of think of it as side effects of a component. You want to do some data fetching, you want to call other APIs. So you'll be doing that inside of our use effect function. And it's executed after render. So once your components, all your components are, or like each component is rendered, then use effect is executed. So that's like what it looks like. So it takes 2 arguments. The first argument is function. It does not have, that particular function does not have any arguments. And this function is where you'll do your fetching or whatever you want your use effect to do. And your second one is an array of dependencies. So what this basically does is, you don't want use effect to be executed all the time. So we're going to get more into it. But it's kind of like your use effect code depends on these things that you pass into your array. Okay, so we here have a component called counter, and then I have this count variable. I'm using use state, and right now my use effect function does not have anything. So I'm just gonna run this first. Okay, so you can see once I click on the button, it calls set count and then the count variable which we've set here, it increases and the component is re-rendering because we are using use state. So now for use effect, what I want to do is, for example, I want like an alert to show up. So once I refresh the page, the first thing that pops up will be this alert. Now, for example, if I am interacting with the website and then I'm clicking on the button and I keep seeing this alert, but I do not want this alert to show up every time. Why? Anyone knows why this is happening, like again and again? Like when I click on click me, why does the alert pop up? Yeah, anyway. Yes, so since we're calling set count on click me, and we're using use state, so it's going to re-render the component. Once it re-renders the component, we know that use effect is always called after rendering. So this is being called again and again. So I do not want that. And how do I sort of fix this thing? So I told you like, there's another argument that use effect takes. It's an optional, but it will help us. It's kind of a trick to do it. So if I send in nothing in the array, then it's going to only use effect will only run on the first render. So it runs on the first render, we see the alert, and then it stops. So it's only going to render, or use effect is only going to be executed on the first render once you pass in an array which has nothing inside. Yes.
Is there a way to make it like when you re-render on like the fifth time or something? Like something like that?
Yes, I'm getting there. So the next thing, so one is without, one is since it's an optional, and if you don't pass in anything, that's the first case. So it's gonna, of course, re-render and like use effect will be called every time. And then the second case would be passing in an empty array where it will only be called on the first render. Now I want it to sort of depend on something, right? I don't want it to be executed all the time. So I'm kind of gonna create a I'm gonna create another variable and use state again. Okay, now I want my use effect to depend on my alert variable here. So I'm gonna send that in inside the array. So now it shows up the first time, and then it's not going to show up when I change the state because it depends on alert. So whenever alert changes, like the value of alert changes, that's when it's going to be called again. So once I click this, alert is getting changed. That's why use effect is being called again, and then I see the alert. Yeah, so this basically, use effect is like used basically to when you're fetching data. So it's really good to pass in your, if you're like saving the data in a list or an array, then you pass that in. And once your data changes, that's when you will re-render your component, and then the data is updated on your website. Yeah. Any questions regarding use effect or use state? Yeah.
Does a variable password dependency have to be a state variable?
Ideally it would be the state variable, but you can pass in anything. Yeah. Any more questions? Yeah. Oh, that's just me changing the value. So I just wanted to show that once the alert value changes, that's when it's going to be called. If I don't change the alert value, then use effect will not be called because it depends on alert. And if it remains the same, then use effect won't be called. Yeah. Okay, we can.
Okay, now we're going to be talking about routing. So this is an example of a link. You've probably seen one before. And what routing lets you do is in React so far, the websites you've made, they've just been one page. So now the question is, how can we add multiple pages to our website? And the answer is going to be routing. Yeah, so right now we've mainly built single page websites. And the thing with React is that it's running in JavaScript. So what a React router will do is it'll figure out what page you're currently on, and then you can have a different component for every page. And so here are some concepts you're going to be seeing when we're kind of covering routing in React. So far you've used the A tag in HTML. But what the A tag does is it'll completely reload the whole page. The advantage with React is we can use a conditional rendering wrapper, which will allow us to only change a certain part of the page when we go to a new a link. And you're going to see an example of this in the demo. All right, and then server versus client-side routing. And so going back to the A tag, it's an example of server-side routing. So when you click like on a link, like the link I showed before, it's going to fetch a whole new copy of the website from whatever website you're going to. The difference between that and client-side routing, which is what we're going to talk about today, is that no new request is completely sent out to the server, which means the whole page isn't going to refresh. You're only changing the part of the website. And then right here, this is how you're going to install the library we're using for routing. At the end, you're going to see the add 5. It's very important to do that because we're using React Router version 5. There's a new version of React Router that has come out, but it has a lot of more quirks, which we're not going to discuss in this course. Now the next topic, which we're going to briefly introduce before we start diving into backend, is how to actually talk to a backend to get data for your website. So there's another library we're going to introduce, which is called Axios. And what that does is it allows us to connect our React app and have it query our backend to receive data. It uses our promise-based HTTP client. And what that means is you've probably used async await that you learned about in the JavaScript lectures. And using that API, you can send and receive all kinds of data. And so this is just a quick example. This is what it would look like. GitHub has an API which allows you to get any kind of user information that you're interested in. And what this does, it's using Axios to go and ask GitHub about some given user, and then it'll print out the information about them. And so, yeah, this talks about the promise API of Axios. We're going to be using async await in this course, so just note that. And we'll also be showing you how to use effect along with Axios and how that becomes important. This is an example of making an HTTP request in React. So as you see, we're putting the Axios request to get the GitHub data inside a use effect. Does anyone have any guesses on why we should do this? Yeah.
Page loads up also, I guess, called the set point.
Yeah, exactly. So we want to make sure when we first load the page, we're getting our data, but there's one other reason we want to do this is that if we just put the Axios call outside of the use effect, every time something in the component changes, it's going to refetch the data from GitHub. And that's like very expensive. It's going to use a lot of network bandwidth. And so it's a lot more beneficial. We just run the request once, then we want to make sure we're not running it again and being wasteful. All right, so now let's take a look at a demo of how to use React Router. Okay. Is that font size all right for everyone? Sweet. So right here, I've created like a sample page and I have kind of two pages, but the problem is that they're all on one page. So I want page one on its own like URL and page two also on its own URL. And so typically the way I do that in a regular HTML website is I'd create like a page 1.html and page 2.html. But in React with the React Router library, you do it in a slightly different manner. So I'll walk you through how you do that. The first step to using React Router is you're going to want to wrap your entire application in the router tag. And you want to put the router tag at the very, very root of your application. So literally everything is wrapped in the router tag. This is kind of just a quirk of its implementation. And then the next thing you're going to want to do is if you take a look at this website, I don't actually want the navigation bar to change when you go between pages. Only like the bottom part is what's actually going to change. And so the way you can do that with client-side routing is by adding the switch tag around all of your content. And what this is saying is it's saying only the stuff kind of like right here is what's actually going to change when I navigate between pages. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create a new URL, which I'll call /page2. And when you go to /page2, it'll actually show the content of page 2. And when you're just at like regular, just like my website, it'll just show page 1. And the way you do that is by using this root tag. And then I'm going to do the same thing for page 1, and I'll give it any kind of path I'd like. All right, perfect. And so now you can see when I go to the main URL, it's going to look at this root right here, and it's just going to show me the page 1 data. Now, if I change the URL to /page2, then I only see the information from page 2. Does anyone have any questions on routing? All right, cool. Now, there's one more issue is normally in HTML before, you've probably used the A tag. When we're using React Router, it's a little different the way we do navigation. React Router exposes this special link tag. And this works very similar to an A tag, except it's just designed for to navigate to URLs that are relative to internal to your application. And it'll allow various optimizations to take place. For example, it won't be reloading the entire page like we saw before. And so now once I have these new link tags, then my links in the navigation bar can work. And really simply, just by adding these new React Router tags, I've been able to add multiple pages to my application. The next thing I want to show you is how you can use effect in Axios to get data from an external source. In this case, I'm going to be using the GitHub API. So the first step is I'm going to create a state variable like we saw last lecture to store the data. I'm going to call it GitHub data. And I'm going to set it to null since we don't have the data yet, and we're going to have to load it in from GitHub. Then I'm going to use a use effect to fetch the data. And I'm going to write a function. And then I'm going to call Axios to go and fetch the data. So I'll call this All right, so I went ahead and I'm printing out the data that we're getting from GitHub to the console. And let's take a look at what kind of data we're getting back. So GitHub returns this object of all sorts of data. It returns my username, returns my avatar's URL. But more interestingly, it shows the amount of people, the amount of followers I have on GitHub. And that's like a really cool stat I'm going to want to show on my website. So I'm going to put this in the state variable called GitHub data. And then I can go here, here's my GitHub information, and I can add a new paragraph where I'm going to show that data. Now, if you notice, the GitHub data starts out at null before we finish loading the data, so I'm going to want to handle that. Right. As you can see, now I'm able to get the data from GitHub, and I'm able to show it on my website. And I've also been able to add multiple pages through routing. Does anyone have any questions on use effect or async await or the Axios call?
Within that set GitHub data, GitHub docs, or GitHub response dot data, instead of doing the dot followers within that, can we just save it as the data and then within the program call GitHub data dot followers or GitHub data any of the other arguments?
Yeah, definitely. You can, that's probably a better way because then you have access to all the data.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the reason we have to use async await is Axios exposes a asynchronous API. And what that means is that it takes a lot of time for it to actually get the data from GitHub. And so what it doesn't want to do is it doesn't want to block your entire program while it waits to get the data. So what await does is it just tells it that we want to wait for this long running request to actually finish before we continue the rest of the program. All right, great. Yeah, that's it for the demo. And this is the secret code for attendance today. It's Beam. Oh, shit.
Also, we have cookies here, so just feel free to grab some.
Is that the last line?
I think so.
How did they signal you out?
I have no idea.
Yeah.